So stress in the UAE is amongst the highest in the world at 88%. That's according to new global research from Cigna in its 2021 360 Wellbeing Survey. So why are we all so stressed? How dangerous is that, and what needs to change? Well, I'm delighted to be joined on AB Talks by Nicklin, who is the best-selling author, and she's also the CEO and founder of Freedm, which is a new creative agency which aims to bring empathy into its industry, an industry famed for its burnout culture, and to their clients. Mimi, welcome to AB Talks.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So if we start with the research, 88%, we are one of the most stressed nations in the world right now. Does that figure surprise you?
No, not really. Not really. I think that for all of us that live in these really heavy cities like Dubai, where it is a real sort of work-life balance, I think those numbers are going to be high. And especially when you look at the amount of progress a city like Dubai has had over recent years. You know, this is a city that's definitely on the move. And anytime sort of a population amongst a city like that is striving for so much progress at all times, you know, really trying to prove where they are on the map, that's undoubtedly going to impact our balance, our personal lives, our stress lives. So no, I think Dubai is on a huge trajectory, and that's probably a sad side effect of so much progress.
You talked there about the work culture, and actually overwork was one of the reasons cited in the research. But I would have said, you know, before coronavirus, work was there always, because Dubai has always been reaching out there. But as the pandemic changed the way we kind of look at our work or work-life balance, you know, have we reached an inflection point? Have we, in short, had enough?
I think so. And I think, you know, the data in the Cigna report is fantastically interesting. There's other data that supports that globally. So there's data from Microsoft this year as well that shows that 73% of people want to remain remote, or at least have some level of remote working. So yes, I think people have had enough. I think they've changed and they've reestablished what they expect from their work, their careers, and their lives. I'm not sure if it's all to do with stress or partly also just to do with outlook, right? These years have just given us an opportunity to see things very, very differently. And I had a friend of mine on the London Tube last week in the crowds, you know, and she wrote to me and said, what have I been doing for 20 years? For the first time ever, I'm reassessing whether I should work in the city. Why am I doing this? And of course, if she hadn't have had those 2 years out, that perspective would have never come to the forefront. So partly stress, part intensity, but partly also just perspective changing.
I mean, that's interesting, because you talk about your friend on the tube. Also in the research, it talks about 50%, more than half of UAE employees are thinking about or expressing an interest about changing their jobs in the next 12 months. Now, in this market in particular, and it's worth saying, actually, the global average is just 31%, so far higher. In this market, we're currently looking at a talent war already here. So what's the risk to employees? Surely this must be a wake-up call. There must be a risk to not moving to address this.
Absolutely, it is. I mean, I was just saying to someone yesterday, you know, if we don't make change, the talent will vote with their feet. Okay, so absolutely, it's a huge risk. You know, either change or lose out. That's really the way it is, especially as the workforce is getting younger, and especially as we're seeing more generations, multi-generations in the workplace than ever before. Those expectations across different people at different levels are really, really sort of expanding and widening. And if employers don't take notice of some of these things, you're right, they're going to lose the people. And in a market where we have to import many of our people, right, Dubai attracts, what is it, nearly 200 nationalities for all different skill sets, we have to keep up. And when you look at lots of the work that's going on globally, change is happening. So absolutely, it's a sort of a call out and a moment, I think, in history for us to take this opportunity, because whilst there's been a lot of trauma, Scott, a lot of bad things have happened in the last 2 years, we're also at a time of just monumental opportunity to reassess and look for new efficiency and new happiness. So definitely, I think it's a time for change.
You mentioned the generations getting younger there, and the workforce is getting younger. And I'm going to dive back into that research one last time. There was an interesting statistic in that said that basically the 18 to 34, the youngest of the respondents, were the most likely to leave their jobs. This suggests that this is something that bosses can now no longer afford to sweep under the carpet, because this is coming at them, whether they like it or not.
It is. And I think it's partly to do with sort of less to lose, right? When you're sort of in your 20s, what are you losing out on really? But partly again due to that perspective and that understanding that there are other opportunities. When you look at the key motivators of staff, again, all around the world, because much of this data is global versus specific.
Yeah.
But when you look at that, things like pay and insurance and pensions have actually moved, consistently further down the list. People are looking for all kinds of different benefits: flexibility, freedom, empowerment, the ability to bring their authentic selves to the workplace, all kinds of other things that are changing. And yes, those young guys, they're very brave. If you think about how that generation has grown up, the world that they have grown up in, right? It's been pretty turbulent. They're not scared of change. They've already seen it all. So absolutely, as they get younger, we have to start creating environments where they want to come, where they want to work, where they want to grow. Otherwise, they just won't stay.
Now, there was another word you mentioned in that sentence there, which was freedom. So I just want to kind of the creative industry, of which I am working as well, has long been famed for high pressure, long hours. How are you going to change that with freedom? What's the overarching mission? What's the vision? What's the quest with your new company?
Well, you said it really. We want to create opportunity and freedom for creatives without barriers or bias. So fundamentally, we want to create a business that allows all creative talent to have access to opportunity, to grow, to do the best work of their careers without some of the barriers that have been sitting in place. And I think there's very much two parts of that. There's the sort of physical and geographical access, and that reaches people, for example, of backgrounds of poverty, people that are perhaps refugees or in war zones, or all kinds of different environments where they may be incredibly talented people that could never otherwise access some of these types of clients and work. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, for me, as a CEO, we can't only look at our little ecosystem, because there's a big, wide world out there. So there is that access part. And then, as you said, Scott, there is the whole part around mental health and well-being. We have nearly 400 million people with depression. We have burnout now being sort of coined by the World Health Organization as a sort of a formal workplace woe. For me, I just cannot understand how we've normalized things like antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication in our industry in order to do our jobs, right? When did it become normal to have to medicate yourself to do your day job? We just have too much stress. And if you underpin that with just a little bit more joy, where's the fun, right? My dad was an ad man. I came into this industry with, all the optimism. I still have it. We loved our jobs. Everyone loved their jobs unilaterally. It was such a fun industry. And we've lost that for many of the reasons you're talking to. Too much pressure, too little time, pressure from clients, procurement. We've seen a massive decline in creative effectiveness, all kinds of areas. And we're trying to really take a cold look at the industry and start from scratch. If you were to create an advertising agency, a creative agency today, having learned from the last 2 years, what would you do? Because if we don't learn, then what a waste of the pandemic.
I wanted to ask a question as well, because it feels like I was going to ask, where do we lose our way? How did we get lost, in your opinion? We started that we loved our jobs, and then there's been this entire kind of like, whether it's shareholder pressure, but there's just this greed is good, run for money, profit all costs, and the employees are basically like, batteries that we use up a battery, throw it away, get another one, plug it in, and off we go, and we keep that engine of output. In a world where we're beginning to embrace ESG, do you feel like we're finally waking up to the fact that actually our employees should be solar powered in some ways? There should be a sustainable solution to allow, these units of output for our businesses to continue operating at their best, rather than just run them down, throw them away.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously, right? I think we should be measuring in value and nothing else, right? Because fundamentally, when you look at the knowledge economy, right, and we've learned this is what I say, if we don't learn from the last 2 years, I'm not saying that there's nothing from sort of 2019 and before that we shouldn't keep and treasure and look after. But so much of what we learned was that there is so much out there in the knowledge economy. There is so much that people can give. And fundamentally, you can trust your people. Okay, so when you ask the question, where did it all go wrong? I think so much of it sits in that. It sits in this lack of trust, this sort of autocratic systemization of the creative industries, where our layers got bigger and bigger and bigger, and there was, you know, all these sub people in the system, all of which, and I've been one of them, right? So all of which have huge role to play in those organizations. But I just think that there needs to be a refocus on the value of our output, of what we're creating and how we get to those results. So for me, you know, at Freedm, we want to empower people to do the best work of their careers. Scott, I want to be a phenomenal creative agency, but more importantly, I want the content, the advertising to be a means to a bigger picture. Why are we in business? To help people. And that's what we've always been in business to do.
How are you going to pay that forward into the client? How are you going to sit around the table and have what could be a difficult conversation with the client and going, no, we're not going to work that way. This is, you know, this is who we are, and this is what we're going to do. You know, if you can make one big difference to how clients work, what would that be?
I think there's two parts of that. I think firstly, probably I won't attract clients that don't want to do something different, right? Because if you want to do it exactly the same, then there's many amazing agencies out there. And again, I've worked for them. There are some brilliant, phenomenal leading companies out there that are doing it that way. So if you want to do it that way, then carry on. You know, they're going to give you excellent product. The second thing is, I think really this becomes a discussion about, if you're talking about sort of negotiation and money and those things, it's a discussion about margin. And that's as simple as it is. Do you believe I'm worth whatever it is, 17%, 20%, whatever it is that you're negotiating with your clients on, right? This is a discussion about margin. I'm going to be totally transparent with you. I'm going to tell you where the money you pay me goes. And that's one of the things I'm really, again, really passionate about. Why are we hiding this? Like, it's as if agencies think that clients don't know what their competitors are charging, when of course they do, because procurement knows full well what everyone's charging, right? And yet we're so secretive in our little agency bubbles. I want to crack that open. I want to say, this is my cost. This is where they're going. This is how it impacts process. You know, if you're working with someone in, I don't know, Nigeria, perhaps with a learning disability, I may need 3 days instead of 1, right? But that's the point. We're doing this for a far bigger picture. You're still going to get the best work you can get in the city, I hope. But you're going to do it in a way where that value system has an onwards action. And again, it comes back to margin. This is what it's going to cost me to do that. We're not going to put ourselves out the market, you know. It's just about a restructure, and being virtual is one of those things, you know, not having heavy costs and heavy offices and burdens and all those things, which I think is a very sort of millennial point of view, right? Who needs an office?
Well, I'm not a millennial, and I believe the same thing myself. He said, sat in an office. All right, so if I'm an employer and I'm reading the headlines, particularly coming out in the US, and I'm seeing the Great Resignation, I'm looking around here, I'm seeing a talent dearth. How do I approach this issue? Where do I start as an employer? Because it can be a scary topic to get into.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I think listening is probably the one core skill that all leaders need at this time. You have to hear your people, understand them. Why are they leaving? Where do they want to go? What are they looking for, right? Listening is going to answer so much of that sort of problem or sort of gray area for you, because fundamentally curiosity drives understanding, right? So if you ask the questions, if you inquire, and you do that proactively and do it up front, if you're a CEO reading the papers thinking, oh, you know, holy Maloney, all my people are going to leave, be proactive about it. Ask them, are you all planning on leaving? I read that 45% are. See what they say and address that, because I don't believe talent are being unreasonable, you know, but they are being different. And, you know, flexibility is probably the greatest, I don't know, currency, skill set of our time. You can't do it the way you always did. Those that transform and change, those will be the guys that win.
So we've talked about the employers. how about the employees, and not just the employees, but basically individuals, whether they're employed or not? What do we need to take away from this moment in time? You know, you say listening. Do we need to listen to ourselves? How do we actually start taking better care of ourselves? Do we need to?
I think we need to be far more aware of ourselves. I mean, I talk a lot in my work about self-empathy, which is basically the ability to understand yourself, right? To just, to your point, exactly hear yourself, work out what you need and plot against that. Also find the time to internalize what's happening in your favor that perhaps you haven't spotted, right? As human beings, we have a real inclination to blame the whole world for everything. It's just the way we are.
Absolutely.
But if you take, yeah, right. But if you take a little time just to slow down and say, what's happening to help me right now? And then what doesn't fall into that bucket, what do I need to change? Do you need to resign? I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. Do you need to resign to get where you're going? Or would a conversation or some feedback possibly, maybe not, but possibly address those problems before you hand in your notice and run off into the sunset? So I think it's about time to understand yourselves, time to really look at that landscape, and often having a business coach or someone trusted around you to talk about in a professional capacity can really help with those conversations.
Is that something that workforces can actually import in? Like, you talk about empathy. How do we create these spaces of empathy within businesses for, you know, to then allow these employees to have these conversations? Because there is, you know, on one side we've got, you know, the employers, and where they're grinding you down into the ground. On the other side, there is kind of like this industry, which is like this almost unrealistic, the pursuit of happiness. I must be happy 100% of the time. And I don't know anybody that actually is 100% of the time. So how do we help? You know, how can workplaces help you find that balance?
I think, you know, you mentioned empathy, which is, of course, one of my sort of passions and specialisms. I work a lot in organizational empathy. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is deeper understanding. That's what empathy is, right? Empathy is perspective taking, if you take everything else away. Greater understanding of your team, of your structure, of yourself. All of these things are gonna really help, because, of course, you're right. You can't be unilaterally happy all the time. That's a completely impossible dream, as it were.
Exhausting, frankly.
Well, yes, and exhausting, exactly. But as organizations, we can significantly improve where things have been and where things are going. And that's why I talk about, you know, looking back on the pandemic and taking learnings. And I feel like I read so much that is encouraging people to rush back to how things were, because perhaps it feels familiar, safe, habitual. But people have changed, yeah. Right? Human beings have changed. You can't disrupt the world for 2 years and expect people not to have been impacted by that. You know, how they want to spend their time, how often they want to see their kids, their family, how often they want to, I don't know, cycle, whatever their thing is. So I think that perspective is really, really important. Taking a step back, looking at where understanding fits in your organization, the type of industry you're in, and then making incremental changes across all areas of culture and purpose to know where you're all heading. Because fundamentally, none of us do well alone, right? Humans aren't meant to be alone. So if you can truly create connections, and this doesn't matter if you're a lawyer, you're in finance, or you're in advertising, right? If you can create that connection between people, your people will do better. When people are understood, they thrive. It's the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. It's the backbone of all evolution.
That feels kind of like a mic drop moment, but I'm going to ask you one last question. Looking forward, because we've talked about some of the things that need to change and some of the issues that are there, but looking forward, fundamentally, what gives you hope?
Oh my gosh, everything gives me hope. Everything, Scott. I'm so hopeful and optimistic. I think the youth give me hope, as we touched on at the beginning of this conversation. They are so hungry for change, and they're so fearless, and they question everything, you know, but why can't you do that? Wow, good question, actually. Why can't we do that, right? So the youth,
because we've always done it this way, and why should you be happy when I wasn't growing up?
Well, that discussion as well. But yeah, I think the youth give me hope. I think our industry is changing, and that gives me hope. You know, I think I've seen, since I launched Freedm, so many people from all over the place come to me and say, we need this, Mimi. And that reassures me. That even though the industry isn't changing fast enough, there is momentum. People do, you know, want change. And I think that as we come out of this pandemic, and I know in Dubai, it probably feels like you're probably sort of out already because it's this wonderful bubble of futurism. But we're not. We're nowhere near out of this pandemic. You know, parts of the world are still being ravaged by the socio-economic impact, not so much the health impact, but the lasting impact. As we come out of that, I have great hope that the world has created new leaders, people that have seen things differently, probably part of that, 40% or 70% of people that want to run away from their jobs, depending on the data set, and are looking for different things. And they've learned to let go and, you know, perhaps take off some of those shackles and roots that they had and be brave. And it will breed entrepreneurialism. And entrepreneurialism, as we know, drives GDP. So I'm super hopeful. I think the world is going to change monumentally, and there's phenomenal people pushing it forwards.
So I'm a bit like Columbo the detective, which is a reference that none of the millennials will get. I always have just one more question. You talked about leaders there, and you're a CEO yourself. In 2021, looking forward and looking at what needs to change, what's your view of leadership? What are the qualities a leader needs today, not that a leader needed 20 years ago or even 10 years ago?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say empathy because it is my, obviously, right? Because it is my favorite word. But no, quite seriously, I think the skills that fall within that bigger umbrella of emotional intelligence are absolutely critical. The next step in leadership is about people. It is about balancing humanism with capitalism. If you're a CEO today, the chances are you know full well how to make money. You know how to manipulate your profit margin. You know how to innovate in product. You know how to set up distribution channels into new markets. You've got that waxed, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be where you are. But the ability to then move your mindset into one that is people first, that actually sees people as our currency and our product in many ways, and elevates human beings in the workplace to create sustainable business. That is the skill of the future. Because if we don't do it, Scott, I have no idea what comes next. But if we don't do it, we've got a very, very bumpy road ahead, because we're human, we're not infallible, and we're not robots. So at some point, we have to slow down a little and reset what has been a very painful path for probably two and a half decades. So yes, I think the future is human. That sounds quite cliche, doesn't it? But I think it is.
It's not a bad point to end the interview on. Nicklin, thank you very much for joining AB Talks today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.